Hello, my name is Tim Watson. I'm an Anglican priest in Hackett. I'm on the conference team here, and it's a privilege to be the first speaker today. So the first thing I want to say is that what we're about is discerning how God is working to renew God's church, and what place communities, such as we have all experienced in different ways, have within God's plan. So in a moment, Catherine Massam and Aiden Glass are going to be speaking specifically about the Australian context, speaking about the 19th and the 20th centuries respectively. My job is to give a general introduction, if you like, a kind of unified field theory of intentional religious communities. At least I'm going to try to talk about that, because of course all the communities represented today are very different. Some people might say they are unrecognisably different. And what I would wish to encourage you to think is to what extent actually these different experiences of community life, traditional, new and emerging as we're calling them, have common features which help us to understand what God is doing to renew God's church and God's world. And I'm going to start with a quote from Archbishop Justin Welby from a talk at a day conference at Lambeth Palace in 2014. This is also on our conference website, you can see it. A conference for specifically traditional and new forms of community. And so Archbishop Welby said the following: "We need a wild burst of fresh and spirit-fueled imagination about religion in the 21st century. It will be embedded in its traditions, but as in all past renewals of religion, it will also be different. Above all, it will be spontaneous, not top-down and under control. So, what needs doing? What institutional changes are needed? How do the churches, we are not all Anglicans here," said Archbishop Justin, "obstruct you, hinder you, when we should celebrate and support? What reimagination do we need?" And that day conference in 2014 led directly to some work in the Church of England, which I was lucky to be part of. And then when I came to Australia nearly 3 years ago, I was talking to Bishop Stephen, and this conference was the result, I guess, of that conversation. So let's cut to the chase, shall we? The first point I want to make is that intentional religious communities, whether they're traditional, new or emerging, are ecclesial entities. They are ecclesial entities. What this means is that they are actually an essential part of God's vision for God's church. They are core to the concept of church. They are not just accessories or options. Intentional religious communities are part of God's will. But the second thing to say is that the basis for their calling is simply baptism. The fundamental unity of all intentional religious communities is that we are called to follow Christ. We die with him, we are resurrected by him, we are empowered by the Holy Spirit, perhaps in a particular way, but the fundamental unity there is the calling to live the baptized life. And then the next point is that communities are part of the work of the Holy Spirit in the world. The Holy Spirit, sometimes in theology, is described as the soul of the church. What that means is that the Latin word anima, which sits underneath soul, simply means animate, the animating force or energy or life of the church. And communities share that animation. They are brought into being by the Holy Spirit. They are, theologically speaking, charismatic, in a sense that the Second Vatican Council has helped us to understand. And they're more important than we might think as well. Two statistics that struck me when I first heard them. First is that if you count all the Roman Catholic priests in the world, there's about 400,000 at the moment. 1/3 of them are incardinated in religious institutes, and 2/3 are in dioceses. So 1/3 of all the Roman Catholic priests operate within the economy of religious communities. But if you add in all the lay religious as well, the non-ordained people, of course, which includes women, then, and there's about 1.2 million of those in total, 3/4 of all of those people called to minister in a formal way mandated by the Roman Catholic Church, 3/4 are operating in the economy of religious communities, and 1/4 on the diocesan payroll, if you like. So that's just a guide, but for me it's really suggestive as we think about the importance of communities within God's will for God's church. So, secondly, let's talk briefly about the defining feature of all communities. Is there common ground between us? Well, there is. And one of the key features there is that communities have common life before they have mission. For a while I worked in the Church of England discussing with new communities which were seeking recognition by the Church, the Anglican Church of England that is, and one of the questions we asked was as follows. In what sense do you now feel you are a community rather than an organisation with aims and purposes? In what way is your life focused on being a community from which your ministry flows, rather than a group of people gathered together in order to do certain things? So communities are places of common life before common mission. And the great Lutheran theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was also a practitioner of community life as well, as is well known, made a distinction which can help us here. It's between Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft, two kinds of organisation, one of which, Gemeinschaft, exists because of its meaning, and the other exists because of its purpose. And Bonhoeffer said, for example, that art can only really exist within a Gemeinschaft because the analogy in a Gesellschaft is advertising, art instrumentalized for a purpose. Whereas in a Gemeinschaft, art can exist because of its own intrinsic meaning. So there's a distinction there, that distinct quality of life. And religious communities have often been described, therefore, in terms of this life being a charism. As I said, they're charismatic in that theological sense. Communities gather around a spirituality, and that is expressed in a time and a place by a founder. So whether you're talking about Benedict of Nursia, or Ignatius of Loyola, or I would say also John Wesley, or Lauren Cunningham of YWAM, there is a founder with an intuition in a time and a place. And that spirituality at the heart of it, that way of praying and being with God, expresses itself in distinctive forms of prayer and action, distinctive forms of community, and distinctive forms of mission. All of those are expressions of that inner life. So communities of this kind are not concepts, they are embodied, lived realities with distinctive practices, and they have, therefore, life-changing consequences, ontological consequences, if you like. Because when you join a community, you accept a rule of life, or in some more contemporary communities, a rhythm. And that rhythm is described in terms which are usually drawn from what are known as the evangelical counsels, ways of expressing that gospel life, that baptismal life. And one of the many traditional formulations is poverty, chastity, and obedience. Now, this is where some people look at newer communities and say, you're not serious, I'm sorry, but you're not taking a formal vow of poverty, you're not taking a vow of chastity, and obedience is very questionable. So I've heard traditional religious saying that people in emerging communities are just play acting. Equally, I've heard people point out that some traditional religious communities are extremely wealthy, somewhat inclined to do their own thing, and I'm not going to comment on chastity here, but we'll set that question aside for a moment. But we're aware that over the history of the church, there are aspirations which we've not all managed to live up to. So what I'm saying here is that all religious communities involve commitments, life-changing commitments within a rule or rhythm of life in the areas of our financial circumstances. They can involve formal total self-gift in terms of poverty. They can involve extensive financial commitments in terms of covenant communities or communities such as Youth with a Mission, which are self-supporting. But they involve a step change in terms of our economic circumstances. They involve a commitment in terms of our emotional and sexual lives. So classically, of course, consecrated celibacy, which is a vital charism, I would say, for the churches to recover. And at the same time, the churches need to understand that people who are married or in other ways of life and being can feel this same call to intentional community life. Maybe that's been one of the big discoveries of the last 50 years for many churches and communities. And the third is obedience, which means that you surrender your own individual will to a process of community discernment at different levels, which can involve a vowed commitment, which traditionally, again, is often for life, but need not always be. And in more contemporary communities, not infrequently, these vows are seasonal, but they are, I would say, no less serious, no less embodied. And it's fascinating to me that new communities such as the Order of the Mustard Seed, which grew out of 24/7 prayer, one of the very first things they did was take life vows. And then some years later, they looked at each other and thought, we're not quite sure what we did there. And they came to talk to people like the Church of England Advisory Council for advice on what they do now. But I would say there is actually an intuition at the heart of any call to community life, an intuition of unconditional self-gift to God, but also incarnate in a particular limited form of life, a spirituality. It's a bit like falling in love in that sense. There is a desire to set your love in order within a community which limits, frames, and makes for your growth and flourishing. And of course, new times have always given birth to new forms. A Benedictine canon lawyer, Dom Richard Yeo, who I used to know, told me that the history of religious life over the last 2,000 years is of canon lawyers like him taking 200 years to catch up with what God is now doing. So that brings us to our next point. So although, as I've said, intentional communities are ecclesial, they are not part of the church's hierarchical structure. They are doing something different. Now here, I'm aware we're in an ecumenical context. What I'm going to say draws on some material directly from Roman Catholic and Anglican churches, which have episcopal structures and therefore canonical distinctions between forms of life. In other churches, you may find these elements are much more mixed. But I think actually, particularly our Catholic friends who are quite good at clarity, it's one of the gifts they bring. Sometimes maybe it needs to be moderated, but I find it very helpful to look at their structures because they help me understand things that God has been doing over time in God's church. So let's quote the Roman Catholic Code of Canon Law of 1983. There are members of the Christian faithful, both clergy and laity, who, through the profession of the evangelical councils, by means of vows or other sacred bonds, recognised and sanctioned by the Church, are consecrated to God in their own special way and contribute to the salvific mission of the Church. So by analogy, that is all the communities represented today with their different forms of self-gift. And it goes on. Although their state does not belong to the hierarchical structure of the Church, it nevertheless belongs to its life and holiness. So our communities and community members belong to the life and holiness of the Church, but not the hierarchical structures. And as we look at the history of our own communities and communities of which we are aware, we'll often see that there is a potential for communities to bring renewal to church structures, but also challenge. So that's the Catholic perspective. And I'm going to cite also an Anglican perspective from the principles of canon law common to the churches of the Anglican Communion. This is all they say on religious communities. They say the faithful may freely associate in a religious order or other society which enjoys autonomy to establish and administer for its life in community its own rule, statutes, or other constitution. Communities, therefore, are, in law, free associations, much as you find in the UN Declaration of Human Rights. Christians have the right to form a free association, which is an ecclesial entity, therefore it's part of God's work. Christians discerning the will of the Holy Spirit. And no one, on the other hand, can be compelled to join them, though in the Anglican and Catholic churches, everyone is in fact part of a parish, whether they like it or not. So there's a different kind of structure here, a different economy, an economy of freedom and grace, which gives rise to distinct opportunities and, of course, distinct challenges. So two analogies I find really helpful to understand this. The first is gardens and girders. So if we think of the hierarchy, say, of my church, the Anglican Church, the hierarchical shape ensures coverage of the gospel. Every parish, at least in theory, exists in a network which provides basic vanilla-flavoured Christianity to all people living on a patch of land. And it's structured through dioceses, there are chaplaincies, there are other such things, there is infrastructure, there are property trusts in Australia. And the girders of the Anglican Church are there to provide the good Anglican gospel, the cure of souls, across the whole of the globe. Now, of course, the Roman Catholic Church has the same kind of structure. So that's one concept, if you like, hierarchical, top-down, organised girders. And the second concept is gardens, organic, bottom-up growth. So when Francis of Assisi, for example, started to renew God's church, he did so moved by the Holy Spirit. It was an organic growth bottom-up. And then what happened is people were drawn to him. And eventually then there was a conversation about ecclesial recognition, but it was an organic growth, a very distinctive and different form of existence. You know, the hierarchy of the church did not call this community, or does not call any community, into being. The community grows bottom up, whereas the hierarchy works top down. And the second analogy which helps me is of light. If you think of the hierarchy of, say, the Anglican Church providing vanilla Christianity, it's providing white light, if you like, to illuminate. It's everything that's needed for salvation and growth. And in a sense, it's undifferentiated. There is a principle which means that Anglican parishes are supposed to provide basic Christian services to all. On the other hand, if you think of the parish system as providing white light, religious communities are providing coloured light, certain aspects of the spectrum which have been limited, broken, separated out, so that some aspects of that baptismal life become more distinctly visible through the work of a particular community for the benefit of the whole, if you like. But green light isn't good for everything. Green light is good for certain things and not for others, and some people don't like green, and some people love green. If you see what I mean, the communities have their own function within that economy. They are limited. Perhaps they are beautiful in certain ways, perhaps they are, you see the analogy I'm trying to make. That both communities, therefore, intentional communities and church hierarchies, are part of God's vision, I would say a necessary part. Both have their role, distinct, different, complementary. And of course, the next question to ask is, what is the relationship then between these communities and their hierarchies or denominations? Well, I'll leave to one side questions of internal governance of communities. I know that both Catherine and Eileen will be saying a little about that later on. I'll just mention here briefly that we're in the area of the ministry of episcopae, the oversight of God's church, which in Catholic and Anglican churches sits with people with purple shirts and pointy hats. But of course that ministry is held in a collegial way anyway, even within the Anglican and Catholic Church. In other churches there is a broader sense of responsibility there. But I was very interested to see that the Code of Catholic Canon Law specifies that diocesan bishops have a role in respect of religious communities, which is quite distinct. It says this: diocesan bishops are to strive to discern new gifts of consecrated life granted to the Church by the Holy Spirit. They are to assist promoters so that these can express their proposals as well as possible, and they are to protect them by appropriate statutes. So in the best case, therefore, and let's just talk positively here, the role of the hierarchies of our churches is to discern new works of the Holy Spirit in community, to assist them and to protect them. And of course, our ecumenical context puts that into a slightly different frame. But I think if the denominations as a whole, in terms of their operating, are seen in that light, and if there is a vision of God in this, that says something very important about how communities and church organisations should articulate so that both can play the part that God has for them. So finally then, I'm just going to say a couple of things about the way in which traditional, new and emerging communities can articulate with each other. This has been a bit of a whistle-stop tour. I'm aware of that. This video will be recorded, hopefully available online afterwards. And of course you can discuss it and get back to me. If you disagree, that's fine, please say so. But I'll just say briefly here, I know that there have been, as I've said, tensions between different forms of communities for all sorts of reasons. But in my experience, and part of my joy in being part of this project, is that there is, across our differences, a real unity, both theologically and in terms of experience. I would describe it as a particular joy of recognition, of a quality of life, a common call that can be seen and found in the other. And there are also examples where communities have collaborated. I'll just mention two to close. The first is a community in New Zealand called Urban Vision, founded by Justin Duckworth, who's now Anglican Bishop of Wellington. But back in the day, he wasn't Anglican at all. He came out of the Youth for Christ context, and he founded, with his wife and others, a community working with vulnerable young people, which did amazing work. And within about 10 years, they met a Roman Catholic sister who came to visit them. And the sister said to them, guys, what you're doing is wonderful. And if you don't now adapt, you will burn out. So she shared with them, for example, the daily office. She shared with them some of the disciplines of community life which they had not yet bumped into on their own. And by drawing on those ancient wells, that community began to find maturity, stability, in order to become more long-lasting, to perhaps become more influential over time. So a real gift from that community in terms of its wisdom to a young community which needed that help. And there's a second example. You may have wondered why I'm here on the terrace of a 12th century abbey in the French Alps, by the miracle of technology. Now, I've chosen this not just because it's a vision of expansive possibilities, but also because this is the terrace of Hautecombe Abbey in Savoy. I had the joy to live there for a while. Hautecombe was founded in the 12th century by Cistercians, and it was then a Cistercian and Benedictine house for many centuries until the late 1980s, when the remaining monks found that the burden of this particular abbey was too great for them. So they contacted a new community called Chemin Neuf, which I've also spent many years with. They rang them up, and Chemin Neuf at that point was a teenage community. It was only 17 years old. It was basically young and urban, and it had lived a different kind of life. And these Benedictine monks rang up the Chemin Neuf community and said, "We feel God is calling us to give you our abbey." And the community members, the council discussed it, and they said, "Why would we want to take on the burden of repairing a medieval roof? And is it our calling to leave the city and go and live in the middle of the country in a place like this?" So they said no. But then on the third request, they came and they prayed on this very terrace behind me. And they received a vision that this medieval monastery could become a formation house, an ecumenical formation house for youth. And so Hautecombe Abbey has become that, and for now 30 years, Hautecombe Abbey has formed a whole generation of young people in discipleship, in theology, in ministry and mission, and for quite a lot of them, has evoked in them a call to intentional community life in many different contexts, in fact. So Hautecombe is an example of a community entrusting its own assets, if you like, to a new community which can take forward in new and surprising ways the charism of the old. And my hope, I think, for the Ancient Futures process is that this is the sort of thing that we will begin to engage in, these kinds of conversations about mutual blessing, discovery, trust, and above all, listening to the Holy Spirit, blowing us in unexpected directions in order that the Spirit may bear through us much fruit for God's glory, the renewal of our communities, and of God's church.